This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 12 of season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, March 20th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford a century ago as we read. The first section in March 20th, 1909 was the About Town section, and the first section I'm going to read is a report on the town meeting. This is by Samuel Taylor. The farmers and all others interested in the state of the estate of the town of Westford, who were of the old enough and know enough type to vote and who were not otherwise disqualified by bruises and defects, were legally warned by warrants and horsepower to attend a game of inning and outing to be played at the annual town meeting, to be held at the town hall Monday, March 15th. The above play took place at the scheduled time of the warrant, as whispered in everybody's ear, and last Monday was exhibition day for the recitation of lessons and the speaking of pieces that have been rehearsing for a year. The Weather Bureau smiled on the day as the voters developed the play, which resulted in bringing a frown as many a bright hope went down. Never you mind, our faces awry, the good and best never hears a first goodbye. That's Samuel L. Taylor at his best as a poet, I guess. The meeting was called to order by Town Clerk Edward Fisher, who read the warrant and called for the election of a moderator. The Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher was elected without contest. Joseph Wall and Albert A. Hildreth were appointed ballot clerks. John M. Fletcher, Fred A. Reed, Albert A. Hildreth, and Joseph Wall were appointed tellers. The second article in the warrant called for the election of town officers, and owing to the sharp contest, a remarkably heavy vote was polled. Of the 458 registered voters, 381 voted, leaving only 77 who did not vote. The voting had no idea of going out of business until 1:30 p.m. This was the way they ran town meeting 100 years ago. It was preceded in the morning by the town election and then followed by what we know as the town meeting in the afternoon. The result of the balloting revealed some surprises to some, if nothing more than majorities. Town Clerk Edward Fisher, 321, elected without opposition. Selectman Edward Johnson, 231, to P. Henry Harrington, 132, Johnson elected. Assessors William L. Woods, 216, George H. Hartford, 144, Woods elected. Tree Warden Harry L. Nesmith, 195, Albert W. Haywood, 163, Nesmith elected. And then there's several others that I'll pass over. The vote on the question of licensing the sale of intoxicating liquors resulted in 153 yes and 203 no, a majority of 50 for no license. You may recall that the previous year, in 2008, there was a small turnout and the license people were able to pass the licensing, but it was repealed in 1909. The contest for selectmen resulted about as expected. Both candidates were exceptionally good men. As there was nothing to choose between the men as to fitness, the contest resolved itself down to party lines. As the Republicans have a large majority in town, they easily elected their candidate, Mr. Johnson. The contest for assessor was a dissatisfaction to many. Mr. Hartford, the nominee of the Republican caucus, who has held the office nearly 20 years and the most competent man in town for the place, was defeated by 72 votes. A variety of causes contributed, chief of which was his long term of service, which no person could hold and be true to the oath of office without developing a feeling of, quote, had it long enough, end quote. There was also a sort of leftover soreness over the acts of some other town officers, and this was the only open and convenient place to balance accounts. This defeat cannot be construed as a personal rebuke, for it is evident from the vote that there were others who had seen a long term of service on the Board of Assessors who would have met a similar reception had they not allowed their feet to take charge of their judgment and get them a safe distance from danger. And then he goes through and talks about several of the articles. And I won't read all of them, but I'll read some representative, some of them. Article 12, to hear the report of the committee chosen to investigate in regard to the improvements on the Graniteville Road. The committee report and substance that a beginning be made this year, a small sum be expended to be taken from the amount raised for town debts and charges. The report of the committee was finally rejected by a small vote after Captain Fletcher in vain tried to open the eyes of the blind so that they could behold the inconsistency of refusing even a few dollars worth of investigation and initiatory work on a road traveled by parties who pay over half the tax of the town. That's a reference to the center of the town. Article 20, to see if the town will raise and appropriate money for specific repairs on the roads at Westford Center as ordered by the county commissioners. This article brought out a lively tilt. Samuel L. Taylor moved $2,000 as recommended by the Finance Committee. This moved almost every section of the town to just let the people at the center know that they hadn't much of anything for roads except bushes, rocks, and mud. The mover of the motion offered evidence in rebuttal to show that of the $4,000 annually raised for roads, 3/4 of that was expended off of Westford Center, that $10,000 had been expended within 10 years in specific repairs in the southerly part of the town, that 3/4 of this tax was paid by the taxpayers at Westford Center, that of the $2,000 asked for, $1,500 would be paid by taxpayers at the center, but no use. Just as the mover of the motion thought he has his opponents just ready for a pinfall, Town Clerk Edward Fisher came to the rescue and made a plea of poverty for the town and claimed the improvements were a luxury. He, by the way, lived in the center of town. Edward Fisher, that is. Article 22, to see if the town will raise money to improve the land adjacent to the William E. Frost School. This brought out more copies of poverty arguments. Having bought 5 acres of land and built a $14,000 schoolhouse, the town suddenly collapsed in a fit of poverty before it had time to finish graveling ankle-deep mud in the avenues to the building. The town, however, faintly revived enough to hear Oscar R. Spaulding move $100 worth of improvements. He, by the way, lived very close, if not next door, to the Frost School that they're talking about. This was amended by a motion for $200. The amendment was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to imprisonment for a year. The original motion for $100 was tried and sentenced to be spread all over a 5-acre lot, all in the name of a lower tax rate. Not true. Go to the foot of the class. The extra $100 would not have raised the tax rate 1/16 of a mill, but would have come out of the overlayings, a clear case of pinching for the sake of saying you have, besides a loss in economy in labor expending so small amount. Article 23, relating to appropriating money to prevent the brown-tail and gypsy moths from spending so much of their time in idleness and eating. It was unanimously voted to give them $800 worth of advice, warmed up with fire. Article 25, to see if the town will raise $250 to purchase fire extinguishers and other apparatus to be placed in the hands of the forest wardens. The Finance Committee recommended $100. John A. Healy and William H. Decatur took the stand in favor of the larger amount, claiming that the villages had fire protection at town expense and that the farming community should be provided for. That one extinguisher was worth many men, pails, and all the other hammer and tongs that go with it. In the interest of harmony and equity, the Finance Committee allowed the larger sum to become law without opposition. Article 35, relating to moving the firehouse in the rear of the town hall to Parkerville. It was voted without dissent to move said buildings and locate it on the schoolhouse land. Article 36, relating to leasing of land of the Abbott-Worsted Company for a term of years upon which Firehouse stands. Julian A. Cameron for the company reported that the company would not lease the land, but would give the town the free use of the land as long as the building remained in its present condition, with the writing allowing the town to remove said building at any time. This plan being cheaper than cash renting, the town accepted it without cross-examination. It's another example of the benevolence of the Abbott-Worsted Company in Westford. Article 38, to hear the report of the Finance Committee in regard to the salaries of town officers. The committee reported as follows: Town Clerk, $25, Selectman, $150, $90, and $70, graded according to term of service. There were obviously three selectmen in this time period, each serving 3 years. Overseer of the Poor, $20 for chairman and $10 each for the other two. Treasurer, $175. And then there's a little bit more on other expenditures at town meetings. The next section is the Westford Center section. Miss Ruth P. Tuttle has resigned her position in the teaching force of the William E. Frost School and accepted a most desirable school in Winthrop. On Sunday, March 21st, the Big Milk team, owned and driven by Fred A. Smith, will leave Westford at 6:30 and not at 9:30, as has been the practice during the winter. At present, the amount carried is 165 cans. I'm pretty sure that this is the collection of milk from Westford dairy farmers, and I'm not sure whether Fred Smith took the milk to one of the railroad depots or whether he took it to Lowell. I'm pretty sure it's one or the other. The academy closed Friday for 1 week's vacation, and the grammar and primary grades at the William E. Frost School have 2 weeks, this last week and next. Tadmuck Club is the next section. The members of the Tadmuck Club held their regular meeting in Library Hall Tuesday afternoon under some difficulties, but it was a good meeting withal. During the 3 years that Miss Locher has been president of the club, Tuesday was the first time that she has been detained at home on account of her own health. She was detained at home with a very severe cold and was much missed by the members in her accustomed place. Mrs. Benjamin H. Bailey, the vice president, was also absent, being out of town. Owing to these circumstances, some matters of business were deferred until the next meeting. It was one of those meetings when some of the gentlemen interested in the club sustained the program. Reverend Charles P. Marshall of the Union Congregational Church gave a very excellent character sketch of Theodore Roosevelt, whose second term as president ended on March 4th, 1909. A fine delineation of this man of action with his forceful personality, and was a skillful resume of some of the salient features of his administration. Leonard W. Wheeler, the town tax collector, followed with a talk on current events. With characteristic keen insight and studious habit of mind, Mr. Wheeler treated a list of subjects of general interest, touching briefly at first on 1 or 2 points of the town meeting the previous day. Other topics were some astronomical information, Professor Lowell's discoveries concerning the planet Mars. These were the famed canals on Mars that Professor Lowell thought that he saw. Halley's Comet, which would be visible in April of 1910, and the dark star. This was a theoretical concept of a star so massive that its gravity would keep light from leaving it. It's not unlike what we know as black holes. Continuing the list of current events, the recent Italian earthquake that was discussed a few weeks ago in the Wardsman, recent progress in the conquest of the air in flying machines. Of course, this is only about 6 years after the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. and the great value of wireless telegraphy as demonstrated in connection with the sinking of the steamer Republic. The Republic was struck by another ship south of Nantucket on January 23, 1909, and sank, but because of the wireless operator on board, all of the people were saved. I believe all of them were saved. Yeah. The next section is called Social. The March Social in the regular monthly series for the winter took place at the Congregational Vestry, now the PCA building on Lincoln Street, Tuesday evening, and was a success socially and financially. The entertainment that followed the business meeting was largely sustained by the children, and as is pretty sure to be the case under these circumstances, was attractive and enjoyable. There were violin solos by Walter Steele and songs by little Florence Wilson, followed by a series of tableaux by the children. The various pictures were depicted by Frances Wright, Daisy Cabell, and Florence Wilson. And there were several group sings also. The large new hanging lamps recently purchased to take the place of the old chandelier were used for the first time and were very satisfactory. The next section is the Graniteville section. Word has been received from William and Fred Wall, who are now located in San Francisco, that they are greatly pleased with California and are getting along finely. William Wall, who went west partly on account of his health, reports that he is feeling better than he has been for the past 5 years and will no doubt make his permanent home in that state. Court Graniteville, Foresters of America, held a very pleasing entertainment after its regular meeting last week, Thursday evening. This court is now growing rapidly and being fortunate in having many young men in its ranks, and the meetings proved to be very interesting. Ford's Village is the next section. Elmer E. Nutting, Fred A. Sweat, John Carmichael, and Edward T. Hanley attended the automobile show in Boston Saturday morning and afterwards visited the battleships in the harbor that have recently returned from a cruise around the world. This was Roosevelt's great white fleet that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. They were among the favored ones who were permitted to go on board. A special interest was taken up in the Vermont, the vessel in which Joseph Orange, a resident of the village, was during the trip. Inquiries made for him brought forth the information from one of the officers that he had been transferred on the homeward trip and is now at Manila in the Philippines. Joseph Leclair, it's spelled capital L-E, capital C-L-A-R-E, of South Barry, was the guest of his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Felix Leclair, over Sunday. I think the surname is actually L-E, capital C-L-E-R-C, as indicated in other town records. Miss Sarah Precious and little niece, Miss Daisy Precious, spent last Sunday with Mr. and Mrs. Michael Keefe of Townsend Harbor. Mrs. Keefe was formerly Annie T. Precious, a sister of Sarah Precious. We finished with this reading with a comment by the publisher. On page 2 of this paper will be found the Westford news of nearly 5 columns, and on page 3, 2 columns of news from the towns of Brookline, Hollis, Townsend, and Shirley. This week, for the first time, all of the news matter was set up on the Mergenthaler standard linotype machine we have recently installed, and it is working very, very satisfactorily. This week we publish all the news matter sent in, the first time for several weeks. The linotype, as the name implies, allowed the operator to type in a single line of text and to have it cast immediately as a narrow slug, which was then used for the typesetting. It was much faster than hand setting the entire type. That's the news in Westford for the week ending March 20th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.